Welcome back. This one stayed with me longer than most. A woman forced to drop her lawsuit against one of the most insulated men in the mid-Atlantic real estate corridor, and rather than collapsing, she built a forensic paper trail so clean it held up in federal court. The move that ended him was not the lawsuit she lost. It was the evidence ledger she quietly assembled afterward. Eternal Diary. The smell hit her first. Coffee, burnt at the bottom of a pot that had been sitting on the burner since 7 in the morning. The kind of smell that soaks into the walls of a place over years, into the low-pile carpet and the particle board cubicle dividers, into the collar of whatever blouse you chose that morning. Nora Vasiliev had been in conference rooms that smelled of bergamot and conditioning leather. She had sat across mahogany tables from men who wore their watch faces turned inward, a habit of old money that signals nothing to announce. She knew those rooms. She had worked her way into them methodically, deliberately, over 11 years. None of that work was visible in the office where she sat now. The chair was the kind with lumbar support, molded from a single piece of low-grade foam, cracked along the seat edge from years of use by people heavier than her. The window behind the desk looked out at the service entrance of a parking garage. Midday deliveries, a forklift that moved at half speed, 2 men sharing a cigarette against a dumpster in the particular way of people who are cold but unwilling to give up the thing that brought them outside. The fluorescent panel above flickered every 40 seconds. She had counted, not as an act of patience, but because counting was what her mind did when it was waiting, the same automatic calibration that made her good at reading financial documents and poor at small talk at company events. Not irregular flickering, but a pattern so consistent it suggested the ballast was dying rather than already dead, which meant nobody had filed a maintenance request. Which meant whoever worked in this office spent enough time here to have simply stopped noticing. Martin Fried had stopped noticing a great many things. This was, on balance, one of the more reassuring things about him. He was the 9th attorney in the city who had returned her call over the past 3 weeks, and the only one who had not, somewhere in the first 20 minutes of their consultation, begun steering the conversation towards settlement as though it were the only rational destination, and the only question was how quickly she could be made to see it. The first attorney had done it with a kind of practiced sympathy that she identified within 5 minutes as the performance of concern by someone who had calculated that it would move her toward agreement faster than directness would. The third had done it with statistics. The 7th had done it by beginning almost every sentence with the phrase, "The reality is," as though she needed to be led gently toward contact with the world as it exists, as though she were a patient rather than a client, as though the reality he was describing had not been one she had already examined more carefully than he was capable of understanding. Martin Fried had done none of these things. He had read the case file she sent him before their first meeting. He had read it again before their second. He had asked in their initial conversation 3 questions that told her his reading had been precise rather than cursory, and he had answered her questions directly and without the softening qualifications that attorneys use when they are managing a client toward a conclusion they have already reached before the meeting began. He was 61. His degrees hung on the wall without frames, held by pushpins. The Georgetown Law diploma was slightly lower on the left side than the right. A coffee ring stained the corner of a manila folder he hadn't moved to a different surface, and his reading glasses sat on top of his head in a way that suggested he had forgotten they were there, not that he was performing the casual intelligence of a man who forgets small things because he is focused on larger ones. With Martin Fried, forgetting was simply forgetting. He had no vanity about it. He had no vanity about much. She had hired him for exactly that. "They want you to withdraw by end of business Friday," he said, without looking up from the document on his desk. His hand was flat on the paper, holding it down by feel rather than sight, the way experienced readers hold a page when they are listening and reading simultaneously. "The letter from Halstead's general counsel arrived this morning." "I know. I forwarded it to you at 6:42. "Right." He finally looked up. The glasses came off his head and landed on the desk with a small sound. "You've read the demand?" "Twice." "And?" Nora did not answer immediately. She had learned, this was a thing she had learned early, before the lawsuit, before Halstead Industries, before any of this, that the gap between a question and an answer was not dead air. It was information. The length of a pause told people something about the nature of what was coming, and she had spent years calibrating exactly what it told them. A short pause said the answer was ready, and she had been waiting for permission to give it. Yet a longer pause said she was still deciding. A very specific, measured pause. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, but the deliberate containment of something that was already formed. Said that she knew exactly what she was going to say, and that what she was going to say was not what the other person was expecting. "I want to understand the leverage," she said. Martin set his glasses on the desk and leaned back in his own version of the cracked foam chair, which was slightly better than hers. The concession to status of a man who had not entirely let go of the markers of professional hierarchy, even in an office that had long since left them behind. Their leverage is that they have Donovan, Pierce, and half the Judiciary Bar Association in their corner. How's their leverage is that Richard Halstead has settled 14 civil complaints in the last 12 years without a single case going to trial, which means his legal infrastructure is extremely practiced at exactly this. Their leverage is your employment agreement. The arbitration clause, which they argue forecloses any civil action in this jurisdiction. We've been fighting it for 3 months. Their position is that the amendment you signed in March of last year, which you may recall was tucked into the 3rd page of a benefits restructuring packet. I remember exactly what it was tucked into. He nodded. He had the quality of someone who believed her when she said things like that, which was rarer than it should be. Constitutes a valid addendum to the original arbitration agreement. If the court agrees, this case doesn't go to a jury, it goes to an arbitrator they have almost certainly retained for exactly this kind of work. There are firms that maintain arbitrator relationships the way other firms maintain client relationships. We have reason to believe Donovan. Pierce has been using the same arbitration panel for employment disputes for the past 8 years. In that forum, Nora, the outcome is controlled. Practically speaking, yes. She looked at the parking garage through the window. A man in a yellow safety vest was leaning against the wall, eating something from a paper bag, his head tilted back, eyes closed, taking 5 minutes out of a day that probably started before she got out of bed, in work that left the body tired in different ways than the work that left her mind tired. Both kinds of tired, she thought, and arrived at the same destination. The difference was what you accumulated along the way. "What happens if I withdraw?" she said. The NDA from the settlement terms kicks in. You receive the compensation agreed upon, you sign the mutual non-disparagement clause, and Richard Halstead continues operating Halstead Industries with no public record of this complaint, this proceeding, or any of the 14 preceding it. His regulatory record stays clean. His board relationships stay intact. The project pipeline he's currently managing, and we're talking about a $2.3 billion development corridor in 3 mid-Atlantic states, continues without interruption. She turned back from the window. Martin was watching her with the particular patience of a man who had watched a great many people receive a great many pieces of bad news, and had long since stopped trying to help them receive it more comfortably. He had found that comfort in these situations was not useful. He had told her this in their first meeting, in the direct way that she had immediately valued. I don't soften things. If you want softening, I'm the wrong choice. She had told him she did not want softening. And if I don't withdraw? Then we go to trial, and we probably lose on the arbitration clause question before we ever get to present a single piece of testimony. And if we lose on arbitration, we go to their selected panel, and in that panel you will receive a fraction of what they've offered in settlement, if you receive anything. Oh, and the record will still not be public, and Halstead will still be operating, and you will have spent the next 18 months of your professional life in discovery and deposition and the kind of sustained institutional pressure that his legal team is specifically designed to create and maintain. They've done this before. They are very good at it. I know they have. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. She nodded, stood, picked up her coat from the back of the cracked foam chair. I want until Thursday, she said. They want Friday. I know what they want. I want until Thursday. I'll give you an answer Thursday morning. She left Martin Freed's office without looking at the diplomas on the wall, or the coffee ring on the manila folder, or the light that flickered every 40 seconds. On the stairs down to the street, she passed a woman carrying a box of files who nodded at her without making eye contact, the brief acknowledgement of strangers in a building who share nothing except the use of a stairwell. Nora nodded back. She pushed through the door and into the October street. The cold was the particular kind that comes after a warm week, pointed rather than settled, as if the temperature were correcting a misunderstanding. She walked 3 blocks without deciding to, then 4 more until she found her car. And instead of driving home, she drove to the river and parked in a lot that was half empty at 11 in the morning and sat with the engine running and her hands folded in her lap. She was 37 years old. She had a master's degree in financial analysis from Penn and a second graduate credential in forensic accounting from Rutgers that she had completed at night over 2 years while working full-time, sitting in classrooms on Tuesday and Thursday evenings with a thermos of bad coffee and notes from the day job still running in a track at the back of her mind. She had spent 6 years at Halstead Industries as the Director of Financial Compliance, which was a title that sounded more administrative than it was. What she had actually done for 6 years was read the architecture of the company's money with the specific attention of someone who understood that in corporate finance, the distance between what documents say and what money does is where every story actually lives. She had been very good at her job. She had been one of the better compliance directors in the company's history, which she knew not from being told. Halstead Industries was not an organization that told people they were doing well. It assumed competence and flagged only inadequacy. But from the pattern of how she was used, when the board's audit committee had questions, they were routed to her. When external regulators came in for a review, she ran the document preparation. When Halstead himself needed to understand the exposure on a particular transaction, it was her phone that rang. Richard Halstead had been aware that she was very good at her job. This was, she understood now with the clarity of distance, both why he had hired her and why he had believed that certain things could happen in certain rooms, and she would manage them quietly the way she managed everything. And go on being very good at her job, because people who are very good at their jobs tend to value the conditions that allow them to continue being so. He had spent 20 years training the people around him to perform that particular calculation, and it had worked every time, and he had made the mistake of assuming it would work this time too. He had not understood that the specific quality that made her good at her job, the reflex to document, to record, to build a contemporaneous paper trail, not because she anticipated using it, but because her mind treated documentation as the natural response to observed information the way other people treated exhalation, as the natural response to inhalation was the same quality that had, over 14 months before she filed any complaint at all, generated a record so precise and complete that when Martin Fried first read it, he had been quiet for almost a full minute, and then said, "You kept all of this." "I keep everything," she had said. She sat by the river and thought about the architecture of the settlement offer. The money was real. She would not pretend it wasn't real. 11 years of building toward a financial position that could sustain a life of professional independence, and the number in the settlement offer was, in a single document, equivalent to several of those years. This was, she understood, not generosity. It was calibration. They had calculated exactly what was enough to make refusing irrational. This was what Halstead's legal team did. They made refusing irrational, and then they documented the offer and the refusal, and in any subsequent proceeding, the documented offer became evidence of their good faith. This was the sophistication of the operation she was looking at. It was not crude, it was engineered. She thought about the benefits restructuring packet. March of last year. The packet had gone out to all directors and above on a Thursday, sent from HR with a subject line that said, "Action required, benefits update, and compensation structure review, signature required by Tuesday." EOD, she remembered leaving it on her desk when she went to the Thursday afternoon compliance review meeting, and when she came back it was still there. And she had signed it on Friday before she left because the alternative was a follow-up email from HR on Monday. And follow-up emails from HR occupied a particular register of administrative persistence that nobody at the director level had the appetite for. She had signed it. She had not read it with the attention she would have given to a contract addendum that was labeled as a contract addendum. Nobody had. This was the point of it. But there was a question here that she had been turning over for 3 days, since she first read Donovan, Pierce's motion on the arbitration clause. The question was not whether the amendment was valid on its face. The question was when it had been prepared. Amendments to employment contracts require a triggering event. Companies do not prepare blanket arbitration clause amendments as a routine matter of benefits restructuring. They prepare targeted amendments in response to specific legal concerns. If she could establish, not assert, but establish with documentation that the benefits restructuring packet had been prepared after her initial internal complaint, the one she had filed quietly and through internal channels 14 months before the lawsuit, then the amendment was not a neutral benefits document at all. It was a preemptive legal instrument, which changed the question of its enforceability entirely. She opened her phone and scrolled to a number she had not called in 4 months. Priya Desai answered on the second ring. Priya had left Halstead Industries 14 months ago. She had been a senior project manager in the development division, the arm of the company that managed construction timelines and contractor relationships for the residential and mixed-use projects that generated most of Halstead Industries' revenue. She and Nora had overlapped for 3 years without ever becoming close friends. Exactly, their work touched adjacently rather than directly, and they inhabited different floors of the same building for the better part of a year without any particular reason to know each other. But they had fallen into the rhythm of lunch twice a week in the building's ground floor cafe, the kind of lunch that doesn't begin as a habit and then one day simply is one. And they had talked about work and not about work and about the specific experience of being women at a certain level in a certain kind of company, which is a conversation that has a texture unlike any other conversation because it requires no preamble and no explanation and no qualification. Priya had left under circumstances that Nora, at the time, had not examined too carefully. The story she had told herself was that Priya had taken a better offer. This was the story that was easiest to hold, and she had held it, because examining it more carefully would have required her to examine other things too, and she had not been ready for that. She had not taken a better offer. She had left because of Richard Halstead. Nora knew this now. She had learned it 4 months ago when she had called Priya for the first time after filing her complaint. The absence of surprise in Priya's voice when she heard the reason for the call had been its own kind of testimony. "I've been waiting for someone to call me," Priya had said, which was a sentence Nora had thought about many times since. "Nora, are you home? Do you have 20 minutes? "I have more than 20 minutes. What happened?" "They want me to drop it." "I know." A pause that had weight in it. "I've been waiting for this call, too." "Did they contact you?" 2 weeks ago, someone from their communications team, very friendly call, just checking in on how things were going, mentioning very casually that civil litigation can be exhausting and expensive for everyone involved, and that sometimes the best outcome is a clean resolution that lets people move forward. She used the phrase "move forward" 4 times in 12 minutes. "Cleaning house. They've been cleaning house for months. They knew you filed. They started making calls the week after." A beat. "Nora, there are more. I've had conversations in the last 6 months with 2 women who worked there. One left 2 years before I did. One left a year after. Both of them said similar things. Neither of them wants to talk publicly. Both of them signed something when they left, and both of them believe that what they signed means they can never say anything to anyone. Those agreements can be challenged. Under current federal case law, an NDA that was used as a condition of a separation agreement, particularly in a case involving alleged criminal conduct rather than purely civil. I'm not a lawyer, Nora." "I know." She paused. "Well, can I ask you something about the benefits packet?" Priya's pause this time was the pause of someone accessing a memory that had been filed rather than prominently stored. "From March?" "Yes. I think I signed it. I was still there in March. I left in June." "Did you read it carefully?" The response came without hesitation, which was itself the answer. "No. Nobody read that thing carefully. HR sent it. There was a Tuesday deadline. I signed it and sent it back." "Why?" Nora told her what she was thinking about. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you prove when it was prepared?" "Metadata, document creation dates on the original file, email threads in the distribution chain. If there's a version of that document that shows it was being drafted at a time that corresponds to my internal complaint, and not to any genuine benefits review process, then the preparation was not coincidental." She paused. "I can't access those documents myself, but there are people who can. She said goodbye to Priya and looked at the river for a while longer. The current moved faster than the surface showed. She had noticed this about rivers, specifically since she was a child. The way movement and the appearance of movement were not the same thing. The way stillness on the surface was often the result of forces working intensely beneath it. Her father, who had been an engineer before he became other things and before the money stopped being regular, had explained the physics of it to her once. She had been about 10. She had never forgotten the explanation because it had the quality of something that applied beyond itself. She started the car. She drove to a FedEx office location that was open until 10 and paid for 2 hours of computer time. The terminal smelled of toner and old plastic, the specific smell of machinery that is used continuously by strangers and never fully cleaned. She sat down, logged into the research databases she subscribed to through her consulting business's professional accounts, and began pulling every publicly accessible corporate filing, employment litigation record, and regulatory disclosure associated with Halstead Industries going back 18 years. This was not a thing she had decided to do on the drive over. It was a thing she had already been doing in fragments over the preceding weeks, assembled in the margins of other work and stored in a folder on her laptop that she had labeled HL Compliance Review because she was a compliance consultant and reviewing corporate compliance records was her professional activity. And nothing about that folder, if examined by anyone, would appear to be anything other than due diligence work in progress. She had been building the folder for 6 weeks without quite acknowledging to herself what it was for, because she was a person who knew the difference between gathering information and deciding what to do with it. And she had not yet decided. She sat at the terminal and built the folder into something more organized. She pulled the Halstead Industries annual reports going back 15 years. She pulled the SEC 10K filings and the proxy statements and the 8K disclosures and the subsidiary-level annual filings from the Delaware Division of Corporations. She pulled the EEOC complaint records that were publicly accessible, which were limited by confidentiality requirements, but which sometimes showed complaint volume and disposition patterns without disclosing identifying information. She ran searches through a court records aggregator for any civil actions in which Halstead Industries or its subsidiaries appeared as a party, limiting the search to the preceding 12 years. By the time she left the FedEx office, she had 17 pages of handwritten notes in a legal pad she had bought at the Walgreens next door, a USB drive with 42 downloaded PDFs, and a list of 6 women's names, directors and senior managers who appeared in Halstead Industries' public filings in one year and not in the next, their departures documented only by their absence from the updated organizational lists in the annual proxy. She had also, in the last 30 minutes at the terminal, found something she had not been specifically looking for: a detail in the annual filing of a Delaware entity called Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC, that she had first noticed 6 weeks ago and set aside as a gap to return to later. The detail was a change of registered agent. The new registered agent was a law firm, not Donovan Pierce, a criminal defense firm. She wrote the firm's name in the legal pad. She underlined it twice, with the kind of deliberate pressure that comes when the hand is executing the judgment of a mind that has just been confirmed in something it suspected. On Thursday morning, she called Martin Freed. "I'm withdrawing," she said. A brief pause that had the quality of a man who had prepared himself for this and had still hoped for the other thing. "Nora, if this is about the money, it's not about the money. I'm withdrawing. Send the letter. Accept the settlement terms as written. You understand what you're signing. The non-disparagement clause is broad. The confidentiality requirements..." Martin. She was at her dining table with the legal pads spread around her and the laptop open and the basil plant on the kitchen windowsill catching the early morning light in a way that made the leaves look almost transparent. "So send the letter." He sent the letter. She signed the NDA on a Friday afternoon in a conference room at Donovan. Pierce that smelled of fresh carpet cleaning and the specific quality of climate-controlled air that expensive buildings maintain to signal the temperature is never beyond anyone's control. The room was on the 23rd floor. Through the windows, she could see a significant portion of the city's downtown corridor, including, if she looked at the right angle, the upper floors of the Halstead Development Building 2 blocks east, which was the company's flagship commercial property, and which had been prominently featured in the Architect magazine piece about Richard Halstead 18 months ago, in which he had described his company's philosophy as building with permanence in mind. Peter Cho, Halstead's general counsel, slid the documents across the table with the practiced smoothness of someone who had performed this gesture many times, enough times that it had lost the friction of novelty entirely. He was a trim man with a year-round tan and the particular grooming of someone who maintained himself the way executives maintain their vehicles. Regular service, no visible deterioration, no evidence of neglect that might suggest inattention. He had a law degree from Columbia and 12 years at 2 of the top 5 firms in the city before moving in-house. And he was, by every measure she had investigated, extremely good at what he did. What he did was protect Richard Halstead. He had been protecting Richard Halstead for 9 years. She had found 2 depositions in which he had appeared as the company's representative. She had read both of them. He was careful and precise, and gave nothing that was not required, and expressed nothing that could be construed as acknowledgement of anything beyond what the specific question demanded. She signed the documents. She did not look at Peter Cho while she signed. She looked at the pen, a weighted thing in brushed nickel with initials engraved on the clip that were not hers and not Cho's and were, she had decided, simply the pen of the conference room, a prop of professional proceedings like the water glasses and the yellow legal pads that nobody would use. She signed every page. She initialed every box. She returned the pen to the table without replacing the cap, and she stood, and she said nothing. "We appreciate your cooperation, Ms. Vasilyev," Peter Cho said. She looked at him for exactly long enough to be polite, which was not very long at all. She left. In the parking garage below the building, she sat in her car for 4 minutes. She counted, not deliberately, but automatically, the way her mind counted things that were happening while she was not deciding to count, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the concrete pillar in front of her. The pillar had a water stain in the shape of something she couldn't quite identify, coastline or root system, or the outline of a state she had never lived in. She looked at it for 4 minutes and thought about what she had just signed. The NDA prohibited her from making public statements about Richard Halstead, his conduct, or the circumstances that had led to her complaint. It did not prohibit her from providing information to law enforcement or regulatory authorities pursuant to an ongoing investigation. It did not prohibit her from providing factual information in response to a lawfully issued subpoena. And it did not prohibit her from continuing to conduct her professional activities as a financial compliance consultant, which was the business she had incorporated 4 months before she filed the complaint, because she had understood even then that her employment at Halstead Industries was, one way or another, already over, and she had prepared accordingly. Preparation. She had spent her adult life on preparation, on the accumulation of position and knowledge and buffer, the patient construction of the conditions that would allow her to do whatever needed doing when the time came to do it. I had 19-year-old Nora sitting in a financial planning seminar at Penn that she had attended because it was free, and she was new to having money of her own even in small amounts, had made a series of decisions that night by night had seemed like nothing much at all, and year by year had compounded into a financial position that could sustain her through an 11-month lawsuit and still leave enough to work from. She was grateful for that version of herself in the same way she was grateful for muscle memory, not emotionally exactly, but with the recognition of someone who understands how much work had gone into building a reflex that now operated without requiring her attention. The NDA also could not, and this was the question she had spent the most time with in the days between Thursday and Friday, or reading case law in the FedEx office, and in her apartment, and in Martin's waiting room with the smell of his burnt coffee drifting under the door, legally prevent the other women from pursuing their own independent legal action. An NDA signed by Nora Vasilyev bound Nora Vasilyev. It bound nobody else. It could not reach backward into the past and bind women who had already signed their own separate agreements under separate circumstances. It could not reach forward and prevent women who had not yet taken any legal action from taking it. She drove home. She made pasta. She ate it at the table with the legal pads around her. She was not unhappy, and she was not at peace, and she was not any particular emotional state that she had a word for. Why? Because the emotional state she was in was the state of someone who has just made a move in a long game and knows the game is not close to over. She opened her laptop. She began, that night, to build the ledger in earnest. The ledger was a term she used privately. In structure, it was a database, a combination of a spreadsheet with over 40 fields and a linked folder of source documents, organized by subject and cross-referenced to a master timeline she had built in a separate document. The methodology was drawn directly from the forensic accounting framework she had been trained in, which she had modified to accommodate the specific evidentiary requirements of federal investigation rather than financial audit. The difference between the two is not as large as people assume. Both require complete source documentation. Both require a clearly established chain from observation to evidence to conclusion. Both require the investigator to be more precise about what she does not know than about what she does, because overreach is the fastest way to undermine a record that is otherwise sound. She worked until 2 a.m, she slept for 5 hours, she got up and worked again. Over the following 6 months, she built the ledger into something that occupied 432 pages when printed, cross-referenced 46 source documents, and contained a timeline with 211 entries covering 15 years of Halstead Industries' regulatory, litigation, and personnel history. She conducted the work through her consulting business, which gave her legitimate professional access to the databases, services, and public archives she needed. The consulting business was real. She had clients, real engagements, real deliverables, and she worked the ledger in the hours that other work did not occupy, which were not as many hours as she would have liked, but were enough. She was efficient. Efficiency, like documentation, was a reflex. What she found, in the 3rd month of building, was the correlation she had suspected but needed to confirm. Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC, the Delaware shell with no employees and no public presence beyond its regulatory filings, had operating costs that had been reported in Halstead Industries' consolidated financial statements as a line item under the heading Advisory and Consulting Services. These costs had fluctuated year over year in a pattern that, when she mapped it against a timeline she had constructed from court records and employment departure dates and EEOC complaint filings, corresponded with a precision that exceeded coincidence to the resolution dates of complaints against Richard Halstead. She stared at this for a long time, not with satisfaction. Satisfaction was not a useful state when you were in the middle of building something, but with the careful attention of someone who has found a pattern and needs to determine whether it is real or whether it is the kind of pattern that the human mind imposes on data, because the human mind is specifically constructed to find patterns regardless of whether they are there. She stress-tested it 6 different ways. She built alternative hypotheses and ran the correlation against them. And she tried to identify legitimate business functions that could explain the cost structure and found none that fit the pattern. The correlation held. Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC, over 14 years, had reported operating costs totaling approximately $14 million. Against a conservative estimate of what 14 complaint resolutions might cost, settlement amounts, legal fees, NDA enforcement infrastructure, ongoing monitoring of former employees to ensure confidentiality compliance, the figure was proportionate. More than proportionate. It was calibrated. This was the architecture of the concealment. This was the mark that the cost of concealment had left in the numbers, exactly as Sylvia Park had told her it would. In a classroom in New Jersey that smelled of whiteboard marker and the specific quality of late evening air in a building where the night students arrive after the day students have left and nothing has been cleaned in between. She also found, in the 6th month, a detail about the criminal defense firm that had become the registered agent for Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC. The firm had 3 partners who were publicly listed on their website. One of them, she found this in a Bar Association directory entry, had previously represented clients in 2 federal investigations involving wire fraud related to corporate obstruction of employment complaints. The firm specialized, according to its own practice area description, in federal regulatory defense and corporate crisis management. People do not retain criminal defense firms with wire fraud specialties as the registered agents for inactive shell subsidiaries without a reason. The reason being invisible in the public record meant that the absence of the reason in the public record was itself meaningful. She wrote this in the legal pad and underlined it once. Then she cross-referenced it to 3 other entries in the ledger and added a note in the gap analysis section that said, "Change of registered to criminal defense firm. Timeline, concurrent with increase in settlement activity in 2022. Federal wire fraud practice area specific to employment concealment. Subpoena power needed. In the 7th month, she called Priya Desai again. "I need you to do something," she said. "Well, tell me." "I need you to have your separation agreement reviewed by an attorney, specifically by an employment attorney with experience in arbitration clause enforceability and ND limitations in the context of federal investigation." Priya was quiet. The quality of the silence told Nora she had understood what the word federal implied. "You're not done." "No." "I didn't think so." A pause. "What am I looking for in the attorney?" "Someone who has worked with the EEOC and who understands the limitations of NDAs in criminal referral contexts." Your agreement was signed under conditions of financial duress. You needed the severance. And it contains confidentiality provisions that I believe you have been interpreting more broadly than they are legally required to be interpreted." "You mean, I think I can't talk? And actually I can." "In certain contexts, with certain protections, yes." She sent Priya the name Diane Chu. She had found Diane Chu the same way she found everything, by reading. A law review article cited in an employment law brief in a case she had pulled from the federal court records database, cited for a specific proposition about the enforceability of arbitration clauses in cases involving concealed retaliatory conduct. She had pulled the article. The author's biography listed 12 years at the EEOC Philadelphia office and a subsequent private practice focused on high-stakes employment litigation. She had read 3 more of the attorney's published pieces before deciding she was the right person for Priya. In the same month, she made the other call. FBI Philadelphia, financial crimes. She had been preparing for this call for 4 months. She had written out, in longhand, what she was going to say and what she was not going to say, and the specific line between them that she needed to maintain, which was the line between providing information relevant to a financial investigation and appearing to be conducting her own investigation in parallel with law enforcement, which would have been both legally complicated and strategically counterproductive. She identified herself as a forensic accounting consultant. She described, in precisely calibrated language, a pattern in the public SEC filings of Halstead Industries and its subsidiary Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC, that she believed warranted regulatory and possibly law enforcement review. She mentioned the correlation between the subsidiary's operating cost pattern and the timeline of complaint resolutions. She mentioned the registered agent change. She did not mention Richard Halstead by name in the first call. She mentioned the company names and the financial pattern. The agent who took the call was named Marcus Webb. She would learn, over the following months, that he had been with the Financial Crimes Unit for 9 years, that he had worked 2 previous cases involving the use of shell entities to conceal corporate misconduct, and that he asked follow-up questions in a way that told her, with precision, that her analysis was not news to him. Not the specific documents she had assembled, but the category of conduct she was describing, which she understood to mean that the pattern of what she had found had been somewhere on the unit's radar already, without the specific financial architecture to build on. She sent him the memorandum. She had spent 3 weeks writing it. It was 47 pages. It was not emotional. It contained no narrative of what had happened to her. It contained no speculation beyond what was explicitly labeled as such and justified with the methodology that distinguished it from mere assertion. It was financial data, regulatory filings, timeline analysis, gap analysis, and in a section titled Investigative Hypotheses and Evidentiary Requirements that laid out methodically the specific questions that the available public record could not answer, and that subpoena power could, the documents that needed to be compelled, the communications that needed to be recovered, the financial records that needed to be forensically examined by people with the legal authority to demand them. She sent it on a Tuesday morning and went back to her other work. The New Jersey REIT restructuring was genuinely interesting. It involved a portfolio of 47 residential properties in 3 counties that were being consolidated into a new investment vehicle, and the tax treatment questions were non-trivial, and the client was asking good questions that deserved careful answers. She gave them careful answers. She worked on the REIT for 3 weeks, and found, in the process, a structural issue in the proposed consolidation that would have created significant adverse tax consequences in the second year of operation, and she corrected it. And the client was genuinely grateful rather than performatively grateful, which was a distinction she could always tell. She heard back from Marcus Webb 3 weeks later. "We've opened a preliminary inquiry," he said. "I understand. We'll likely need additional documentation from you at some point." "It's prepared." A pause. She had learned by then the quality of Marcus Webb's pauses. He was not a man who paused for effect. He paused when he was deciding whether to say something. "Ms. Vasilyev, how long have you been working on this?" 7 months? Before or after you signed the settlement?" She let exactly 2 seconds pass. "I'm a forensic accountant, Agent Webb. Reading financial documents is what I do professionally. What I've provided you is the product of that professional activity." He did not ask another question on that topic. "We'll be in touch." She gave him everything she had. She gave it in the format that federal investigators work from, which she knew from her compliance career and from reading, once, an SEC Enforcement Division practice manual she had found in a university law library and spent a weekend with. Indexed, sourced, cross-referenced, with a key that allowed any data point to be traced to its primary source in under 30 seconds. In the 8th month, Diane Chu called. "I see my client's agreement has significant limitations that she has not been informed of," Diane said. She had a brisk, economical quality on the phone, the voice of someone who did not spend words she didn't need to spend. "The confidentiality clause is enforceable as a civil matter. It is not enforceable against her cooperation with a federal investigation. It is not enforceable against testimony compelled by subpoena. And under the Speak Out Act as currently applied, it cannot be used to prevent her from initiating contact with law enforcement regarding conduct she personally witnessed or experienced." She's willing to cooperate? She's been waiting for someone to tell her she was allowed to. Will she speak to a federal agent? She will. A pause. Nora. She has contemporaneous notes, written the same days they occurred, time-stamped. That's in her phone. Time-stamped contemporaneous notes. In federal financial fraud investigations, in sexual misconduct prosecutions, in any proceeding where credibility and timeline are contested, contemporaneous documentation created in real time is the closest thing to unimpeachable evidence that the evidentiary rules recognize. Not because it cannot be challenged, but because challenging it requires demonstrating fabrication, which in the age of smartphone metadata is extraordinarily difficult. "Make the introduction," Nora said. "I'll send you Agent Webb's contact information." The introduction happened. Priya spoke to Marcus Webb for 2.5 hours in the federal building on Market Street on a Wednesday in the early spring, 8 months after Nora had signed the NDA in the conference room on the 23rd floor. Whilst the information Priya had was not financial, it was operational. It was the specific kind of information that a woman who is adjacent to the conduct acquires not by being a direct target, but by being in the building, by being in the meetings and the hallways and the professional proximity from which certain things become visible, whether or not you were looking for them. She had dates. She had locations. She had specific language she remembered because the brain holds onto specific language when it occurs in the context of alarm, the way the body holds onto the memory of physical pain. She had the timestamps. In the 9th month, Cassidy Tran called. She had found Nora through a professional association database, the Forensic Accounting Credential Network, which listed members publicly with their practice areas and contact information. She had worked at Halstead Industries as a senior financial analyst 4 years before Nora had joined. She was quiet on the phone, with the particular quality of quietness that is not shyness, but the habitual cautiousness of someone who has spent years believing that what she says could be used against her. Nora let her talk. Cassidy had left the company suddenly, in a way that she described as having been managed. The word she used was managed, and the way she used it conveyed exactly what she meant. Out of her position after she raised a complaint internally. The complaint had been handled by HR under a process she was told was confidential, and which she later understood had been shared with Richard Halstead's office within 48 hours of her filing it. She had been offered a separation package that included a severance of 18 months' salary and a confidentiality agreement that she had signed without having it independently reviewed because she was afraid and because the HR manager who presented it to her had described it as standard and because she was 29 years old and did not yet know that standard is a word that means nothing in a legal document. She had lived with the agreement for 4 years. She had interpreted it to mean she could not speak to anyone about anything, ever, and she had not spoken to anyone about anything, and she had carried it the way you carry something heavy over a long distance, not dramatically, not visibly, but at a cost that accumulates in ways you stop noticing because noticing would require acknowledging the cost. I kept notes, Cassidy said somewhere in the second half of their conversation. I kept them at the time. I wrote down what happened and when it happened and what was said, and I saved them in a folder on my personal computer, and I have never known what to do with them. How detailed are they? Very detailed. I'm a financial analyst. I keep detailed records. Nora felt something that was not quite warmth, and was not quite the satisfaction of confirmation, and was closer, perhaps, to recognition. The recognition of her own quality of mind in another person. The way you recognize a specific kind of attention in someone because you share it and have spent your life in rooms where other people did not. I'm going to send you the name of an attorney, she said. Her name is Diane Chu. She's going to explain to you very clearly what your agreement actually means and what it doesn't mean, and then I want you to decide what you want to do with your notes. I already know what I want to do with them, Cassidy said. I've known for 4 years. I just didn't think anyone would ever listen. Someone is listening now. She gave her Diane Chu's number, and then she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the basil plant in the window catching the spring light, and she thought about Sylvia Park in the classroom and the red marker and what she had taught, which was not really about accounting at all, which was about the way that systems designed to conceal things inevitably leave marks in the very architecture of the concealment, because concealment requires resources, and resources leave trails, and trails can be followed by people who know where to look. The third woman came through Cassidy. They had known each other from the company, not closely, but enough. The third woman had, in addition to her own account of her own experience, an email. An email from Richard Halstead's corporate account to his communications director, written in the weeks after the third woman's internal complaint had been filed, referencing the complaint by its internal project code, Tidewater, and using language about managing the Tidewater situation that was, in the specific way that sophisticated people write carefully incriminating emails, self-evidently not about a property development project. She had printed the email on the day she received it, or perhaps forwarded to herself and printed. She was not certain of the exact sequence, but she had printed it and put it in a folder and kept it for 3 years in her home office. In the second drawer of a filing cabinet she had moved twice across 2 apartments because she could not explain why she kept it, except that she knew it was important and she had no place to bring it. An email from Richard Halstead's company account to his communications director. Retained. Preserved. Available. Marcus Webb received a copy of that email on a Wednesday. The preliminary inquiry became a full federal investigation the following Monday. The indictment came down 11 months after the inquiry opened, almost exactly 2 years after Nora had sat by the river on an October morning with her hands in her lap and thought about the architecture of what she was agreeing to. She was at her desk when the alert appeared on her phone. The New Jersey REIT restructuring had been resolved 4 months ago, and she was working on a compliance review for a financial services firm in Philadelphia that had engaged her specifically because of her reputation for meticulous documentation. A reputation that had, over the preceding 2 years, become the organizing feature of how people described her to other people who were looking for exactly that. She read the alert. She set the phone on the desk, face down. She finished the paragraph she was reading in the compliance review. Then she picked up the phone and read the alert again. The charges were federal wire fraud for the use of electronic communications, including, specifically, the Tidewater email to facilitate payments through Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC, that constituted fraudulent concealment of the nature and purpose of those funds from the company's shareholders, its board, and federal regulators. Obstruction of justice, for conduct that the indictment described as a coordinated scheme to prevent the filing and pursuit of complaints against Richard Halstead, including the preparation of the Arbitration Clause amendment the FBI had established through documents recovered under subpoena from Halstead Industries' legal department, that the amendment had been drafted not in the context of any general benefits review, but in direct response to Nora's initial internal complaint, 14 months before the lawsuit, exactly as she had suspected, and 3 counts of federal sexual misconduct statutes, some brought on behalf of Priya Desai, Cassidy Tran, and the third woman, whose name the indictment designated, as was standard, by her initials. The indictment was 53 pages. She read all of it. It was thorough, it was sourced, it told a story that was coherent and complete, and that she recognized in its structure and its sequence as a story built from a foundation she had provided. Not as the only foundation, not as evidence she had gathered alone, but as the ledger that had told Marcus Webb's team where to look, and what questions the subpoenas needed to answer, and what a sufficient evidentiary record would require. She put the phone down again and went back to the compliance review. The trial lasted 6 weeks. She testified on the 7th day. She was on the stand for 4 hours in the morning and continued after the lunch break, which she spent eating a sandwich in a small room adjacent to the courthouse that had a water fountain and 2 plastic chairs and a window at ground level through which she could see the sidewalk and the feet of people passing, and once, a dog on a leash that paused directly in front of the window and looked in at her with the specific blank directness of a dog that has not yet formed an opinion about what it is seeing. She answered questions about financial analysis, about forensic accounting methodology, about the specific structure of Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC, and the correlation she had identified in its operating cost pattern, about the gap analysis framework and what it had suggested about the documents that needed to be compelled. She was asked, on cross-examination by one of Halstead's defense attorneys, a man named Lawrence Brigg, who had large hands and the habit of pausing before each question for slightly longer than necessary, whether her analysis had been motivated by a personal grievance against Richard Halstead. She said, "My civil complaint was about what happened to me. My forensic analysis is about what the numbers say. I am a forensic accountant. Numbers don't require me to have feelings about them. They require me to read them accurately. I read them accurately. What they say is in the record." Lawrence Brigg looked at her for a moment. Then he said he had no further questions. On redirect, Francesca Lim asked her one question. She asked, "Ms. Vasiliev, in your professional judgment, does the financial pattern you identified in Halstead Capital Advisory LLC's operating costs admit any interpretation other than systematic payment for the suppression of complaints?" She said, "I built 6 alternative hypotheses and tested the data against each of them. None of them fit the pattern as well as the suppression interpretation does. I looked for the legitimate business function that could explain the cost structure. I did not find one." She stepped down from the stand. The jury deliberated for 3 days. She spent those 3 days at her desk working on the Philadelphia Compliance Review and on a new engagement she had taken on with a regional hospital system that had questions about the treatment of certain deferred compensation obligations. The hospital system work was genuinely interesting and would take several months. Thus, the verdict came back on all counts. She was at her desk when Martin Fried called. She was eating a sandwich, turkey and sharp cheddar and too much mustard, a habit since graduate school. And she did not put it down when she answered because she had been eating before he called, and there was no reason to stop. 15 years, Martin said. She chewed, she swallowed. The financial counts or the misconduct counts? All of them. Concurrent on the misconduct charges. Consecutive on the fraud and obstruction. 15 total. Mandatory minimum language that his attorneys are going to have a very difficult time with on appeal. They'll appeal. Of course they'll appeal. His team is already... Nora, are you listening? Yes. This is significant. What you built, the memorandum, the timeline, the analysis, Lim told me that was the foundation. She told me without the financial architecture you provided, they would not have known where to aim the subpoenas. Subpoenas are their tool. The ledger was mine. It's the same result. The ledger is just a record, she said, and then she thought about Sylvia Park and did not say the rest. Thank you for calling, Martin. She finished the sandwich. She worked on the hospital system engagement until 4 in the afternoon, when she had a scheduled call with the compliance officer that she had prepared for that morning. The call went well. The compensation question had a cleaner answer than either of them had expected, and the compliance officer was relieved. Awkward and relief in clients has a particular quality that Nora had come to appreciate over the years. Not the effusive gratitude of someone who had been expecting disaster, but the quieter relief of someone who had been carrying a concern and can now set it down. After the call, she tended the basil plant, which had grown significantly. She trimmed it. She set a few stems in a glass of water on the windowsill. She wrote in the legal pad a single entry on the last page. Final entry, all accounts closed. She held the pen for a moment. Then she closed the pad. Her phone buzzed. A number she did not have saved. She read the message once. Read it again. Ms. Vasiliev, my name is Renata Osei. I worked at Halstead Industries until 2019. I've been following the case. I have documentation that was not part of the trial record. I don't know if it matters now, but I've had it for 6 years, and I think someone should see it. She looked at the basil plant in the window. She looked at the last page of the legal pad with its single final entry. She opened a new legal pad. She placed it on the desk. She picked up her phone. She typed, Ms. Osei, send me what you have. She did not open the new legal pad that night. She set the phone down after sending the message and went to make tea, the way she always made tea in the evenings. Loose leaf in a small ceramic pot she had bought at a market on South Street 4 years ago, steeped longer than the instructions suggested because she preferred it strong, poured into a mug that had a small chip on the handle rim that she had never had repaired because she had never found the chip inconvenient enough to warrant the effort. Small decisions about small things had always been, for her, the texture of a life that was otherwise organized around large ones. The mug, the basil plant, the too much mustard. She was not someone who needed her private life to reflect her professional one. The professional one had enough architecture. Renata Osei's reply came while the tea was steeping. Thank you. I wasn't sure you would respond. I have 43 pages, emails and internal memos. They're about Halstead Capital Advisory and a second entity I don't think anyone has looked at yet. I'll send them tonight if that's all right. She read the message twice, in the specific way she read things that required her attention to work properly. The first reading for the surface content, the second for what the surface content implied about what was not stated. A second entity. No, she had not found a second entity. She thought about this while she poured the tea. She thought about it with the careful attention she gave to any moment where the ledger she had built turned out to have a gap she had not identified. This was not a comfortable feeling. She was good at finding gaps in her own analysis. She had built the methodology with that quality deliberately, because the most dangerous errors in forensic accounting are not the ones made in haste, but the ones made by a mind that has become confident in its own completeness. Every analyst reached a point where they believed they had found everything, and that was the point where they started making errors. She had always known this intellectually. Having it confirmed practically, even now, after the verdict was in, had a particular texture that was not pleasant. Had a second entity, hidden within the same architecture she had examined for 11 months, and had believed she understood completely. She carried the tea to the desk. She sat down. She thought about Sylvia Park's red marker phrase, follow the architecture of concealment. And she thought about what it meant that she had found the architecture, but had apparently not followed it all the way to its foundations. She thought about something else. The verdict was in. The sentence was 15 years. Richard Halstead was, as of this morning, a convicted federal felon awaiting transfer to a facility where he would spend the next significant portion of his life. The case was, by every conventional measure, closed. But a second entity meant there was potentially more money. Potentially more victims, not necessarily of the same conduct, but of a system that had been more elaborate than the prosecution had known. Potentially more concealment, more obstruction, more of the specific kind of financial crime that her training existed precisely to find. She pulled a legal pad toward her. She wrote Renata Osei's name at the top of the first page. Below it, she wrote, HCI, Subsidiary Entity 2. Below that, she wrote, Timeline, unknown. Structure, unknown. Purpose, unknown. The documents arrived in her email inbox at 11:17 that night, 43 pages as promised, scanned in high resolution from what appeared to be physical printouts. the kind of printout made by someone who had printed documents from a corporate system and preserved them in paper form, which was, she had come to understand over the past 2 years. Oh, the specific act of preservation that the most useful witnesses performed instinctively and without legal coaching, because they understood, on some level, that paper in a drawer is harder to delete than data on a server. She poured a second cup of tea and began to read. By 1 a.m, she had read all 43 pages twice and taken 11 pages of notes. The second entity was called Halstead Legacy Capital Partners, LLC. It had been incorporated in the Cayman Islands, not Delaware. It did not appear in any of Halstead Industries' consolidated financial statements because the company had not been disclosed as a subsidiary. It had been structured, from the documents she was reading, as an independent investment vehicle in which Richard Halstead and 2 other named individuals held membership interests. The 2 other individuals were Douglas Pratt, the CFO, who had worn the blue tie on competence days, and had twice told her that the valuation methodology was appropriate and the external auditors had signed off, and a man named Thomas Veldkamp, whose name she had seen once before, in a footnote in a proxy statement 4 years ago, listed as an independent strategic advisor in connection with an acquisition that had later been written down. The documents Renata had preserved were internal memos and email chains dated between 2017 and 2019, the year she had worked at the company, discussing the movement of funds from Halstead Capital Advisory, LLC, the Delaware entity, the one the prosecution had built the wire fraud case on, into Halstead Legacy Capital Partners, the Cayman entity, where they were reinvested in a set of real estate assets that were listed, in these internal memos, at values that bore no apparent relationship to any market assessment she had ever seen applied to similar assets. This was not what she had been looking for when she built the ledger. The ledger had been about one thing, but what Renata Osei's 43 pages described was the next layer of the architecture. Not just the payment of settlement funds through a concealed vehicle, but the subsequent laundering of those funds into offshore assets at inflated valuations, which was a pattern that did not merely compound the original wire fraud, but transformed it into something that carried significantly longer federal exposure. Something that, if pursued and proven, would apply not just as to Richard Halstead, but to Douglas Pratt and Thomas Veldkamp as well. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at the time. She looked at the mug with the chipped handle. She thought about the 15 years. She thought about the 3 women who had filed and testified and waited for a verdict. She thought about Priya's message, "I saw the news. Thank you for knowing it wasn't just us." She thought about Cassidy on the phone saying, I kept everything, and the sound of her voice, which had been the sound of someone who had been carrying a weight for so long that the prospect of setting it down was not relief, but disorientation. She thought about Renata Osei, who had worked at the company until 2019 and had kept 43 pages for 6 years in whatever physical form she had kept them, in a folder in a drawer, in a box in the back of a filing cabinet she had moved through multiple addresses, because she knew they were important without knowing what to do with them. She picked up her phone. She did not call Marcus Webb at 1 a.m. She was not a person who called federal agents at 1 a.m. unless there was a genuine emergency, and this, while urgent, was not an emergency. She drafted him an email. She wrote 4 sentences. She attached 2 of the most significant pages from Renata's documents and wrote a 5-line summary of their relevance to the completed investigation and their potential to establish a predicate for a second proceeding. She sent it at 1:32. She went to bed. She slept well. She had slept well for most of the preceding 2 years, with a quality of sleep that she attributed not to peace, exactly, but to the specific rest that comes when you have done the work you were capable of doing, and done it as precisely as you knew how, and placed it in the hands of people whose job it was to do the rest. You could not do everything. You could do what your skills and your access and your specific, particular, trained attention made you capable of doing. And then you could sleep, because the alternative was to lie awake cataloging all the things that were not in your control, which was a list so long it would outlast any night. She had been told, at various points in her life, that she had too much control over her own emotions, that she was impenetrable, and that she did not seem to feel things the way other people felt things. She had heard this from 2 men she had dated, from a former colleague who had once told her, with what appeared to be genuine concern, that she came across as though nothing really touched her. She had thought about this for a long time, with the same careful attention she gave to any assessment of herself, because she was not indifferent to accuracy about her own nature. She had concluded that the assessment was wrong. She did feel things. She felt them precisely. The difference was that she did not externalize them in the way that other people found legible, because she had learned early that externalized feeling is information about yourself that you give to other people to use however they choose. And she had never been comfortable with that particular form of generosity. She felt, for instance, the weight of what had happened to her at Halstead Industries, the specific physical weight of it, which had sat in her chest for months, and which she had learned to carry without adjusting her posture. She felt the sting of the conference room at Donovan, Pierce, and the too smooth gesture with which Peter Cho had slid the NDA across the table. She felt, when she thought about Cassidy Tran's voice saying, "I kept everything," a specific quality of something that was close to grief for a kind of suffering she recognized and had not been able to prevent in other people. She felt these things. She simply did not perform them. Marcus Webb replied to her email at 7:45 the following morning. "Ms. Vasiliev, we need to talk." "Available for a call at 9? She replied, "Yes." He called at 9:02. He had read the 2 pages she had attached. He had questions. Precise, targeted questions that confirmed he had understood immediately the significance of what she had sent. And she answered them with the same quality of precision and the same care about the distinction between what she knew and what she was inferring that she had brought to every previous communication with him. "Halstead Legacy Capital Partners," he said. "Cayman, not disclosed to shareholders or the board. The 3 members are Halstead, Pratt, and Veldkamp." Pratt was CFO during the settlement period. Yes, he signed the consolidated financial statements that included the Halstead Capital Advisory operating costs as advisory and consulting services. If he had knowledge of the true nature of those costs and certified the financial statements anyway, that's a separate exposure. Under Sarbanes-Oxley. Among other things. A pause. She could hear in the background of his office the quality of a building that was already working. Phones, footsteps, the ambient sound of an institution that does not stop. How solid is your source on these documents? She worked in the CFO's office. She was a senior financial analyst reporting to Douglas Pratt's deputy. She had legitimate access to the documents she has provided. She retained physical copies contemporaneously. The documents contain metadata consistent characteristics that suggest they are authentic, but obviously forensic authentication would be your process, not mine. She'll cooperate. She reached out to me. She kept the documents for 6 years. She's been waiting for someone to listen. She paused. She will cooperate, Agent Webb. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The appeal on the Halstead verdict." "Yes. If there's a second investigation and a second indictment, the evidentiary weight on the original conviction increases considerably." "I know. That's not why you're bringing this to me." It was not a question, and she treated it as what it was, an observation, offered in the specific way that Marcus Webb occasionally offered observations, which was without judgment and with a quality of simple accuracy that she had come to respect over the course of their working relationship. She said, "Well, I'm bringing it to you because it's what the documents say, and because the documents are in my possession, and you are the appropriate person to have them." "Right," Marcus Webb said, with the brevity of a man who had found his own working relationship with precision. Diane Chu took Renata Osai as a client 3 days later. Renata was 34 and had been working for the past 5 years as a financial analyst at a fund in the city that had nothing to do with real estate development, and she had gone there the way people go to work that has nothing to do with the place that hurt them, by finding something adjacent but not touching, close enough to use her skills, and far enough to avoid the specific smell of the thing. She had dark eyes and the careful economy of speech of someone who has thought about what she is going to say before she says it, which was a quality Nora recognized and valued. They met once, in person, at a coffee shop in Center City on a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after the sentencing, 6 weeks after the verdict, 2 years and 1 month after Nora had sat in the parking garage below Donovan Pierce and thought about what she had just signed. The coffee shop was the kind that had exposed brick and handwritten specials on a chalkboard and a specific ambient noise level that fell between the loud that makes conversation impossible and the quiet that makes it fraught, settling at a volume where two people could speak at normal register and not be overhead. Nora arrived first. So she ordered the same coffee she always ordered in places like this, black, nothing added, in the largest size, and sat at a table near the window that looked out at the street. Renata arrived 2 minutes later. She sat down without ceremony, ordered tea, and said, "I was afraid you wouldn't take me seriously." "Why?" "Because the verdict is already in. Because I thought maybe it was too late to matter." "It's not too late." Diane said the same thing. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "I've had those documents for 6 years. I kept them because I didn't know what else to do with them. I kept them the way you keep something you know you'll need but don't know when. Like, you know you'll need to look at them again someday." Nora thought about Cassidy Tran's voice. She thought about Priya's text message. She thought about the way a woman who has seen something and had no place to bring it for years sounds when she finally hears that someone will listen. "You knew what they were," Nora said. It was not a question. "I knew they weren't right," Renata said. "The numbers didn't make sense. The valuations were too clean. In real estate, valuations are never that clean. There's always noise, market variance, comparable discrepancy, something. These had none of that. They were round numbers at round multiples, and the assets they were applied to were not the kind of assets that produce round numbers at round multiples. But I was 28, and Douglas Pratt was my boss's boss, and when you're 28 and you see something that doesn't look right, the options are to raise it and see what happens. Or to print it and keep it and wait for a day when you are not 28 and Douglas Pratt is not your boss's boss." "You made the right choice." "I don't know that. I know I'm here." They sat for a moment. Outside, a bus moved through the intersection with the specific lumbering authority of public transit in a city where the infrastructure predates any given transit system by decades. "The second investigation is going to take time," Nora said. "Probably longer than the first one. The Cayman structure adds jurisdictional complexity. The accounting fraud elements are going to require a forensic team with broader access than I had. But the foundation you've provided, the internal memos, the email chains, the valuation documents, gives investigators a specific and coherent architecture to build from. Will it be enough?" She thought about this honestly, in the way she thought about everything, without the softening of optimism, and without the distortion of pessimism. It's the same kind of foundation the first case was built on, and the first case produced a 15-year sentence. Renata looked out the window. The bus had cleared the intersection. The street was ordinary again. "I know you signed an NDA," she said, without looking away from the window. "I know they made you drop the lawsuit, and I know you signed the NDA, and I know what people probably thought when you went quiet." She looked back. "I didn't think you went quiet. I kept reading the case filings when they started coming out. I could see the financial analysis in the federal charges. I could tell someone who understood the architecture had described it to the investigators. I knew it was you before I looked you up." Nora said nothing. "How did you do it? Well, you were bound by the NDA. How did you keep going?" She thought about the river and the current, and the way the surface appears still while the water beneath is working. She thought about the methodology she had been taught, and the way it had structured her approach not as revenge, and not as strategy exactly, but as the application of the specific skills she had spent her adult life developing to the specific problem in front of her, the way a surgeon does not agonize over the cut, but simply makes it with the precision the anatomy requires. She said, "I read the documents they gave me. It's in the NDA had gaps." "What kind of gaps?" "The kind that they left because they were confident, because they'd done it 14 times before and it had worked every time, and when something works every time, you stop examining it as closely as you should." She paused. "They made the mistake of believing I was going to stay inside the agreement they designed, but agreements are only as complete as the person who drafts them understands what needs to be covered. And nobody who works for someone like Richard Halstead understands the limits of that kind of concealment as well as someone who spent 6 years reading his financials from the inside." Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You knew more than they thought you knew." About the money. Yes. And the money was the whole thing. The money, Nora said, is always the whole thing. The conduct is human. The money is the record of it. She finished her coffee. She looked at the street. A woman walked past the window with a child who was refusing to walk at the expected pace, dragging in the particular way of children who have found the friction of sidewalk more interesting than the destination. The mother did not pull. She waited. The child eventually moved. "Get me a copy of everything you've sent Diane," Nora said. "I want to build the forensic framework before the second investigation formally opens. The cleaner the framework, the faster they can aim the subpoenas." Renata nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, a physical folder, heavy with paper, and slid it across the table. "I brought copies," she said. "I brought copies of everything." Nora looked at the folder. She looked at Renata. "I know," Renata said simply. "I know you're going to read every page." She was already reaching for it. The second investigation opened formally 6 weeks later. Marcus Webb called to tell her, which he was not strictly required to do, but which she had come to understand was his way of acknowledging, within the constraints of what he could share, that the work she had done continued to matter. She was at her desk. She was working on the hospital system compliance review, which had developed a question about the adequacy of certain disclosure controls that she found genuinely interesting. The kind of interest that her work reliably produced when the problem was real and the stakes were practical rather than theoretical. She noted the call in the new legal pad. Month 1 of the second ledger. Federal investigation opened. Halstead Legacy Capital Partners, LLC. Subjects, Halstead, Pratt, Veltkamp. She dated the entry. She underlined the date with the precise, deliberate pressure of someone making a mark they intend to keep. She turned the page. She went back to work. Outside the window, the November light was settling into the specific quality of early afternoon in the city, clear and cold and flat, without the warmth of summer light or the golden distortion of early autumn, simply itself, simply the light of a day that is doing what days do, regardless of what is happening in the rooms beneath them. The basil plant was doing well. She had been concerned about it through October, when the temperature in the office had fluctuated with the building's heating system resetting itself for the season. But it had come through. It was green and dense and smelled, when she brushed her fingers along the stems, of something clean and slightly sharp. Not sweet, not soft, but present. Exactly present. She worked until 6. She put on her coat. She turned off the desk lamp. She stopped at the door and looked back at the office. At the desk, and the legal pads, and the open laptop, and the plant in the window, and the last of the afternoon light on the windowsill. At the room where she had spent 2 years building something that held. She turned off the light. She went home. The new legal pad filled over the following weeks in the way she filled all of her legal pads, with notes that were not sentences exactly, but compressed thought. The private shorthand of a mind that processes information faster than language can transmit it and has developed an intermediate code. Initials. Arrows. Numbers with question marks that resolved over subsequent pages into numbers without question marks. She went through legal pads the way other people went through notebooks, which was not the same thing. Notebooks were for writing. Legal pads were for thinking. She had been thinking in that way since she was very young. Her mother had thought in lists, grocery lists, task lists, lists of things that needed to happen before a particular deadline. Her father had thought in equations, or had before the equations stopped mapping onto the world with sufficient accuracy, and he had to find other methods. She had grown up watching both of these approaches and had arrived, somewhere in her early 20s, at the legal pad as a synthesis. Not a list and not an equation, but a working document, a place where observation and inference could exist on the same page, and the relationship between them could be tracked. The first legal pad she had dedicated to Halstead Industries had begun not when she filed the complaint, and not when she decided to build the ledger, but 11 months before either of those things, on a Thursday evening after a meeting in which she had sat across a conference table from Richard Halstead and 2 members of his executive team and understood, with the cold clarity of someone whose mind treats pattern recognition as a primary sense, that the meeting was not about the quarter-end close review it had been scheduled as. The meeting was about her. She had not written about what had happened. She had written about what it meant for the work she was doing, which was also about what it meant for her position in the organization, which was also about what it meant for the 2.5 years she had accumulated there, and the institutional knowledge she had built, and the particular irony of having spent 2.5 years learning the architecture of a company's finances with sufficient depth that you now understood precisely how the money moved when a problem needed to disappear. She had written, that first Thursday, 4 pages. She had written them in the kitchen of her apartment at 11 at night, with the basil plant on the windowsill and the city making its specific night sounds outside. And when she had written them as if she were conducting a gap analysis of the meeting itself, what was said, what was not said, what the pattern of both implied about the internal logic of what was happening. She had written without deciding what she was going to do with any of it, because the practice of writing it was its own purpose, independent of use, said. It was documentation. It was the reflex she could not turn off and had long since stopped trying to. She had kept all of it. Every Thursday night page, every legal pad, every note taken in the FedEx office terminal at 11 in the evening. She had kept the originals in a fireproof box she had bought at a hardware store in West Philadelphia and kept in the closet behind a box of winter coats, which was not a sophisticated concealment strategy but was a practical one. Because it required no technology and no password and no internet connection and could not be remotely deleted or corrupted. Paper in a box, the oldest archive in the world. She thought about this sometimes, when she was working on the ledger and the methodology was demanding and the results were not yet clear. The way that the most durable records are always the simplest ones. The memos that people print, the emails that women keep in folders, the notes in phone apps with timestamps that cannot be altered retroactively, the 43 pages in Renata Osie's drawer, the folder full of Cassidy's precise, detailed, contemporaneous record of what had happened to her written in the specific prose of someone trained to be accurate rather than eloquent, which is the best kind of prose for the purpose it serves. Oh, she had built a forensic case on foundations laid by women who had documented things without knowing why, driven by the same reflex that drove her. Not strategy at the time of documentation, but the simple conviction that what had happened was real, and that real things deserved to be recorded, and that the record, once made, should be kept. Not for any particular purpose, simply because it was the truth, and the truth was worth the paper. The truth was worth the paper. She had never said this out loud to anyone. It was not the kind of thing she said out loud. It was the kind of thing she knew, in the way she knew the methodology and the gap analysis framework and the importance of distinguishing between what the numbers showed and what they proved, not as an article of faith, but as a working principle, tested against experience, so found to hold. It had held. She turned another page in the new legal pad. She wrote the date at the top of the page in her compressed, specific hand. She wrote the subject, Halstead Legacy Capital Partners, LLC. Forensic Mapping Phase 1. She drew a box around it, neatly, with the ruler she kept on her desk for exactly that purpose. Inside the box, she wrote a single question. Where does the money go after Cayman? Below that she wrote, Follow the architecture. She underlined it once. She began. She worked on the hospital system compliance engagement until the afternoon light left the room entirely and the office shifted from the gold of late November sun into the blue-gray neutrality of a city evening settling in. She did not turn on the overhead light immediately. She sat in the dimming room for a few minutes, but in the way she occasionally allowed herself to sit in dimming rooms. Not meditatively, she would not have used that word, but with the specific quality of attention that occurs when the visual field softens, and the mind, no longer processing light and shape and the surface of things, turns inward with less friction than it would otherwise. She thought about the 15 years. She did not think about it in the obvious way, the way a person thinks about justice delivered, or satisfaction achieved, or any of the language that other people would have expected her to use. She thought about it the way she thought about the completion of a forensic analysis, as an outcome that the methodology had produced, and that was sound because the methodology had been sound, and that now existed in the public record, where it would remain regardless of what Richard Halstead's attorneys filed on appeal. She thought about the 3 women whose names were in the federal record, who had been subpoenaed and testified and gone back to their lives carrying the specific weight of having participated in a proceeding that asked them, formally and in a room full of strangers, to be precise about the most imprecise kinds of harm, the kind that leaves no physical mark, and that the world has a long history of finding ways not to see. They had been precise, all three of them, Priya with her time-stamped notes, Cassidy with her folders, the third woman with her printed email. Precision in the face of a system that had counted on their imprecision, that had been designed around the assumption that they would be uncertain and ashamed and afraid, that the weight of the NDA and the cost of the lawsuit and the smooth professional machinery of Donovan Pierce would be enough to keep the architecture invisible. The assumption had been wrong. She thought about what it had cost to be wrong. 15 years. A company in federal receivership pending the Pratt and Veldkamp proceedings. A board that had disbanded. A legal infrastructure that had spent 9 years protecting one man and was now being dismantled by the same federal process it had been designed to obstruct. She thought about Peter Cho and the brushed nickel pen. She turned on the desk lamp. She opened the new legal pad to the page with "Follow the Architecture" underlined once. She wrote, below the underline, note in the small compressed hand that was entirely her own and entirely unreadable to anyone who had not spent considerable time studying it, the architecture is always there. It just requires patience to find it. She drew a line through it. Not because it was wrong, because it was the kind of thing you write when you are finishing something and beginning something else simultaneously. And the writing of it is for your own ear. And once you have heard it, you don't need it on the page. She drew a box around the question she had written earlier. Where does the money go after Cayman? And she set the pen down on the legal pad and reached for the folder Renata Osei had handed her across a coffee shop table on a Saturday morning. She opened it to the first page. She read,